The day Helen Townsend arrived in Millhaven, Texas, the wind was blowing so hard it nearly stole the hat right off her head, and she figured that was probably the land's way of warning her that nothing out here was going to be easy. She stepped down from the stagecoach with a carpet bag in one hand and a letter in the other. The letter from her late father's attorney informing her that she had inherited 40 acres of scrubland on the outskirts of town. 40 acres of rock and dirt and dried grass that nobody had wanted to buy, which was how Helen, at 24 years old, had ended up standing in the middle of Millhaven, Texas in the spring of 1878, with dust in her teeth and nowhere else to go. She had come from St. Louis, where she had spent the better part of 4 years working as a seamstress in a textile shop that smelled of lye soap and damp wool. She had been good at it, honest about it, had tucked away enough pennies to feel almost comfortable. And then her employer had sold the shop, the new owner had brought his own seamstresses, and Helen had found herself standing on a St. Louis Street corner with a letter about 40 Texas acres and nothing to lose by trying. Millhaven itself was not much to look at. It had a main street of sun-bleached wooden storefronts, a saloon that never seemed to close, a general store run by a man named Garfield who charged too much for everything, and a livery stable at the far end of the road that smelled exactly like you would expect a livery stable to smell. There was a church, white-painted and leaning slightly to the left, and a small schoolhouse that served the ranching families scattered across the surrounding land. The town had a sheriff, a man named Abbott who wore a beard that reached his collarbone and appeared to take his job seriously enough. It had maybe 300 souls counting everyone within a 10-mile radius, and it had the particular quality of frontier settlements everywhere, which was that it was either going to grow into something or blow away entirely, and nobody yet knew which. Helen walked into the general store first because she needed supplies and because she needed information, and because walking into a strange town without understanding its rhythms was how a woman alone got herself into trouble. Garfield was indeed behind the counter, a broad man with a sweaty forehead and an appraising look that Helen recognized and ignored. She bought flour, salt, coffee beans, dried beans, and a new candle since her own had burned down during the overnight stage stop. She asked about the road out to the Townsend acreage, and Garfield drew her a rough map on the back of a paper bag, which she thanked him for. She was turning to leave when the door opened and the man walked in. He was tall, somewhere around 30, with dark hair under a weathered hat the color of tobacco, and he had the kind of shoulders that came from actual work rather than any kind of vanity. He wore trail-dirty clothes, a worn leather vest, and boots that had seen considerable miles. His face was all strong angles and sun-bronzed skin, and when he looked up and noticed Helen standing there, he nodded once in a manner so perfectly polite and utterly unself-conscious that she found herself noting it. "Morning, Garfield," he said, and his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who did not feel the need to fill silence. "Milton," Garfield said. "You want the usual order ready by Friday. That would be fine." He glanced at Helen again, not in the way Garfield had glanced at her, but in the way a person looks at something unfamiliar that they are trying to understand out of honest curiosity. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Good morning," Helen said, and she went out into the brilliant Texas sun. She did not think about him again for 3 days. She was too busy for thinking about anyone. The 40 acres her father had left her had a house on them, technically. She discovered this when she arrived and found what might charitably be described as the bones of a house. The walls stood. The roof had 2 significant gaps in it. The floorboards were warped from rain coming through those gaps, and something small and determined had taken up residence in the back corner of what might once have been a sleeping room. She spent the first night wrapped in her traveling blanket under the most solid section of the roof, listening to the Texas dark, which was enormous and full of insects, and not at all like St. Louis. She was not a woman who wept over circumstances. She had not wept when the textile shop closed. had not wept on the stagecoach despite the dust and the aching seat, and the man across from her who snored without interruption for 9 hours. She sat in the broken house that night and she thought carefully and practically about what needed to happen. The roof had to be fixed before anything else. She could patch fabric, so she understood the principle of patching, but she did not own a hammer and her carpentry knowledge was theoretical at best. She needed to earn money while she fixed the place up, which meant she needed to find work in or near Millhaven. And she needed water, which meant finding the well her father's map indicated should be somewhere on the southeastern corner of the property. She found the well in the morning. It was still good, which felt like the first genuine piece of luck she had received in some time. She hauled up a bucket and drank and stood in the early light looking at her 40 acres. The land was not beautiful in any conventional way. It was not the rolling green hills of the Missouri River Valley where she had spent her earliest childhood before her family's fortunes had taken their particular downturn. But it had something. It had space, a quality she had not realized she had been missing until she felt it, that enormous open sky pressing down on the horizon in every direction, the dry grass going gold in the morning light, a cluster of mesquite trees at the western edge that threw dappled shade. She could see the shape of something in it. She did not know yet what that shape was exactly, but it was there. On the 4th day, she walked back into Millhaven and asked at the church if there was any sewing work to be had. The minister's wife, a small, energetic woman named Mrs. Pratt, hired her on the spot to mend the curtains in the Sunday school room, and then, once she had seen Helen's work, to alter 3 dresses for the Hendricks women who had recently arrived from Georgia and found that Texas required somewhat different construction in a garment. It was enough for now. It was a beginning. She was coming out of the Pratt house on a Thursday afternoon with her thimble still on her finger when she nearly walked directly into Milton Warren, who was carrying a length of lumber on his shoulder and not looking where he was going any more than she was. "Pardon me," they said, more or less simultaneously, and then both stopped. He recognized her. She could see it in the way his expression shifted from startled to something more settled. "You're the woman from Garfield's store," he said. "You came in on the stage last week." "Helen Townsend," she said. "I inherited the old Townsend acreage east of town." He shifted the lumber on his shoulder and put out his free hand. "Milton Warren. I run cattle about 3 miles north of your property line." She shook his hand. It was calloused and large and warm, and the handshake was firm without being performative. "You're a rancher," she said. "Among other things," he said. "How are you finding the acreage?" She considered giving the polite answer and then decided it was too much trouble. "The house has 2 holes in the roof and something living in the back corner. The land itself is more than I expected. Better, I mean." He nodded slowly. "Your father bought it about 15 years ago. Never did develop it. I always thought it had potential." "So did I," she said. "This morning." Something moved in his expression then, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. "Good luck with the roof," he said. "Thank you," she said, and they went their separate ways. She thought about that handshake longer than was strictly necessary. He appeared at her property on a Saturday morning, which was 5 days after their conversation. He arrived in a wagon with a younger man he introduced as his ranch hand, a 19-year-old named Pete who had enormous ears and a cheerful manner, and they had lumber in the wagon and tools. And Helen stood in the doorway of her broken house and looked at Milton Warren with an expression she hoped communicated both gratitude and the clear message that she was not a woman to be pitied. "I did not ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed. He stood easy, not defensive about it. "But the Hendricks family mentioned you were living out here, and I was coming this direction anyway for my own fence line, and I have extra lumber." She looked at the lumber. It was good quality. "I have money," she said. "Not a great deal, but I will pay for materials and your time." "Materials, maybe," he said. "Time is my own to spend how I like." He looked up at her roof with an appraising eye. "You could use 4 new boards across the east section and something to seal around the edges. The floorboards are going to need replacing eventually, but you could shim them for now. She had not told him about the floorboards. How do you know about the floorboards? I looked at this property before your father bought it, he said. Those boards were bad then. That was 15 years ago. She stepped back from the door. Well, she said, I have coffee made. He smiled then, a real one, brief and contained and genuinely warm. I would appreciate that. They worked the whole day. Milton and Pete handled the roof while Helen passed materials up and kept a steady supply of coffee going on the small iron stove she had managed to get functional. She was not the kind of woman who stood by and watched other people work, so she also took a hammer and addressed the 3 worst of the floorboards herself, a process that took her twice as long as it would have taken Milton, but resulted in boards that no longer moved underfoot, which she counted as a success. In the afternoon, Pete discovered that the creature in the back corner was a mother raccoon with 3 kits, and the process of relocating them without injuring anyone, human or animal, occupied a cheerful 45 minutes and ended with Pete getting nipped on the thumb. The raccoon family installed under the mesquite trees with what seemed like good grace, and everyone in approximately good spirits. Helen made supper from her stores, simple food, beans and cornbread, and the last of the salt pork she had brought from town, and the 3 of them sat on the patched floor of her house in the early evening and ate it. Pete talked almost continuously in the uncomplicated way of young men who have been working physically all day and are now comfortable. Milton spoke less, but what he said was always measured and often genuinely interesting. He knew this country, knew its patterns and its history, knew where water ran underground and which months were dangerous for fire, and how the Comanche trade routes had once crossed this land before the reservation years changed everything. An injustice he spoke of quietly, and without pretending it was not what it was. You speak honestly about it, Helen observed, when he had finished saying that the land they were sitting on had been hunting territory for generations of people who had never had any say in its redistribution. Why wouldn't I, he said. Most men I've met prefer the version of the story that doesn't make them uncomfortable, she said. I suppose, he said. He looked at his coffee. Doesn't make it less true. She looked at him for a moment. He was not looking at her, was looking at the darkening square of the window, his face in profile, and she thought that there was something unusual about him, something she could not yet name precisely. They cleaned up and Milton and Pete loaded their tools and Helen thanked them both at the door in the blue dusk. I'll be by Friday to check the seal on the east patch, Milton said, settling his hat. You don't have to, she said. I know, he said. He came on Friday, and the Friday after that, and the one after that. It was not romance, not then. It was something quieter and more careful than romance. Something more like 2 people who had each learned to be self-sufficient, discovering, with some surprise, that the presence of another person could be something other than a complication. He would find some small task that needed doing, always something real and not invented, because Milton Warren was constitutionally incapable of the kind of transparent pretense that some men deployed in the service of courtship. She would have coffee made, and later in May, when she had planted a small kitchen garden, she started being able to offer him things from it, early radishes, green onions, and one morning in June, a tomato so red and perfect she put it on the windowsill for half a day before cutting it. She had found work enough to keep herself. Mrs. Pratt continued to send sewing her way, and she had taken on alterations for 2 of the ranch families, and in May she made a decision that felt large and possibly foolish, which was to spend a portion of her saved money on 5 laying hens from a farm widow named Bessie Alcott, who kept the best chickens in 3 counties. The hens required a coop, which required materials and work she could not entirely do alone. Milton built the coop. He did it over 2 afternoons, and he built it more solidly than it strictly needed to be, with ventilation and a proper door latch that would keep foxes out, and when it was done and the 5 hens were installed in it, Helen stood looking at it for a long moment. "It's a good coop," she said. "Hens do better with stability," he said, which was so dry and so accurate that she laughed, a real laugh, the kind that came from the chest, and he looked at her when she laughed with an expression she caught only for a second before he looked away. She thought about that expression for a considerable time afterward. It was Pete who said it first, being 19 and therefore unencumbered by subtlety. Helen had come over to the Warren ranch in late June to return a borrowed handsaw, and Pete was in the yard mending a bridle, and he looked up at her and said, "Milton's been in a considerably better humor since you got to town, Miss Townsend, just so you know." She looked at Pete with the particular steadiness she had developed over years of dealing with people who said things they perhaps should not have. "Thank you, Pete," she said, and she handed the saw to Milton, who had emerged from the barn with a look on his face that suggested he had heard Pete perfectly well and was experiencing what might be described as mild mortification. "I'll take the saw," Milton said. "Pete says you've been in better humor," Helen said. "Pete talks too much," Milton said. "He does," Helen agreed. "Is it true?" There was a pause. Milton looked at her steadily, which was his nature. He did everything steadily. "Yes," he said, simply and directly, the way he did most things. Helen nodded once and said, "Good," and went home. And that night she sat on the step of her patched house in the warm June dark and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the specific and complicated warmth of being regarded. It was a Sunday afternoon in July when he asked her. They had ridden out together on the eastern edge of her property, where the land dropped into a shallow arroyo and then rose again into a long flat table of good grass, and they had been quiet for a while in the comfortable way that had developed between them, two people who did not need to fill every moment with sound. The sky was the particular blue of Texas summer, a blue so deep and saturated it seemed almost invented, and there were thunderheads building to the southwest, still distant, their bottoms flat and their tops towering white. "Tell me something," Milton said. "What?" He seemed to consider. "Tell me what your perfect life looks like," he said. "Not what you have now. Not what you're working toward. Just if you could close your eyes and open them and it was exactly right. What would it be?" She looked at him. He was watching the approaching clouds, not her, which she understood was his way of making it easier to answer honestly. She was quiet for a moment, not because she did not know, but because she had not been asked before. Nobody had asked her that, not her father who had meant well, not the women at the textile shop who had been her friends of a kind, not any man who had shown interest in her before, and there had been a few. Nobody had asked her to describe the whole of it, the inner picture she had been carrying. She took a breath and she told him. She said she wanted the house to be real, not just patched and functional, but genuinely solid, with a proper porch so she could sit outside in the mornings with her coffee and watch the land wake up. She wanted the kitchen garden bigger, twice the size at least, with tomatoes and beans and squash and maybe an apple tree on the south side of the house, even though it would take years to bear fruit, because she believed in planting things you might not live to see in their full glory. She wanted the hens to keep multiplying, and she wanted eventually a milk cow, because fresh butter was the specific comfort of her earliest childhood, and she missed it with an ache that was almost physical. She said she wanted to be known in this town. Not famous, not important in any grand way, but known the way people are known in communities that have had time to settle, known for her work and her word and her presence. She wanted to make things with her hands, the sewing, the garden, the keeping of a house, in a way that mattered to someone other than just herself. And then she paused, and she looked at the thunderheads, and she said the last part quietly. She said she wanted someone beside her, not to manage her or direct her or provide for her as though she were incapable, but someone who was interested in who she was and willing to be known in return. Someone who would sit with her on that porch in the morning and not feel the need to make every silence into conversation. Someone who was honest about difficult things and gentle about tender ones. She stopped. She felt the warmth in her face that was not entirely the July sun. Milton was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That is a very clear picture." "You asked," she said. "I did," he said. He finally turned and looked at her, and what was on his face was so simply and openly serious that she felt it land in her chest like something dropped from a height. "I'm glad you told me." She looked at him. "Why did you ask?" He took a moment. Then he said, "Because I wanted to know what I was working toward." The thunderheads rolled in that afternoon, and it rained on the way back, warm summer rain that plastered her hair to her forehead and made the horses steam. And she was laughing by the time they reached the shelter of her mesquite trees, and Milton was laughing too, which she had not quite seen from him before, full and unguarded, and she thought that sound was one of the finest things she had ever heard in her life. He did not kiss her that day. He was a careful man, which was not the same as a slow man. He was careful in the way of people who had been hurt by carelessness and had decided to do things right or not at all. What she learned over the weeks that followed was his story. She learned it in pieces, the way you learn anything real about a person, not in a single declaration but in fragments offered at the right moment. His parents had come to Texas from Georgia after the war, part of the great westward movement of people trying to outrun what the war had done to the South. His father had been a hard man, not cruel, but relentless in the way that relentless men sometimes confuse with virtue. Milton had spent his youth in that relentless shadow, and had emerged from it with a quiet self-sufficiency that looked like solitude, but was actually something else. He had built his ranch from nothing, first a single section of leased land, then a purchase, then another, had built the herd from 12 head to nearly 200 over 8 years of calculated work and some luck with calves. He had been engaged once, at 26, to a woman from San Antonio who had ultimately decided that a working cattle ranch was not the life she had in mind. He spoke of it without bitterness, with the particular fairness of a man who had thought it through. "She was right," he said simply. "She would have been miserable. I would have felt responsible for that misery. It was better." "Don't you feel lonely?" Helen asked. They were sitting on the step of her house in the August evening, which had become a regular thing without either of them formally announcing it. He thought about it. "I did," he said. "Less so recently." She looked at the dark horizon. "Me too," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat there in the warm dark, and neither of them said anything, and it was the most completely right thing Helen had felt in years. The kiss, when it came, was on a Wednesday. A completely ordinary Wednesday in early September, when he had come by to help her repair the garden fence that a wandering deer had demolished overnight, and they were working side by side in the early morning, and she said something that made him laugh, and he looked at her mid-laugh, and then the laughter faded into something else entirely, and he stepped toward her and she did not step back. And he kissed her with such careful and genuine warmth that she understood immediately that this was not a man who did anything carelessly, including this. When they separated, she looked up at him and said, "I have been waiting for you to do that for approximately 2 months." "I know," he said. "I was making sure." "Of what?" "That you wanted me to," he said, "and that I was doing it for the right reasons." "And are you?" He looked at her with that straight, serious look. "Yes," he said. She believed him. That was the thing about Milton Warren. He was the kind of man you believed. September in Millhaven moved forward in the way of things that are both busy and good. Helen's kitchen garden was still producing, the last of the tomatoes clinging to the vines, the squash coming in heavy. She had taken on a new sewing commission from a ranch family 12 miles out, which meant occasional trips that took a full day. And Milton always knew when she was going, and was always somehow present with a reason to be in the direction of her route, not because he doubted her capability, but because the country was wide and occasionally populated by men who did not behave as men should, and because he was constitutionally inclined to be where she was, and she had stopped pretending she minded it. The town had noticed them, of course. Small towns noticed everything. Mrs. Pratt made a comment about spring weddings with a pointed kindness. Garfield at the general store somehow managed to look unsurprised every time they came in together. The minister's wife invited them both to a harvest supper at the church in October as though they were already a unit, which, Helen reflected, they more or less were. It was at the harvest supper that she met Dora Finch. Dora was a year older than Helen, brown-haired and direct-spoken, who had recently come to Millhaven with her husband Frank, a carpenter, and their 2-year-old son. She sat next to Helen at supper, and within 20 minutes had established that she liked straight talk and good coffee, and had no patience for people who said what they did not mean. Helen liked her immediately and completely. "Is that the Warren man?" Dora said, nodding across the room to where Milton stood talking with Frank about something involving construction. "Milton, yes," Helen said. "He's been looking at you every 30 seconds since we sat down," Dora said. "Regular as a clock." Helen did not turn around. She felt it actually, the warmth of being watched by someone who watched you well. "He does that," she said, with a quality in her voice she had not quite heard from herself before. Dora looked at her with the frank assessment of a woman who understood what she was seeing. "You're in love with him," she said, not unkindly. "I think I am," Helen said, which was the first time she had said it in any form, even this indirect one, and hearing it in her own voice made it suddenly and completely real. She told him that night. They were walking back from the church, the autumn air gone cool and sharp, the stars enormous overhead in the way they only got in country with no other lights to compete. He had her arm through his, and they were walking at the pace of people who are not in any hurry to reach the end of the evening. She stopped walking. He stopped too, looking at her with the question on his face that he was too mannerly to ask aloud. "I love you," she said. Simply, the way she had come to do most important things, having learned from watching him that there was more courage in a direct statement than in any amount of careful approach. He looked at her for a moment that lasted long enough that she was aware of the night air on her face, and the distant sound of the church piano being put away inside the building, and the very loud sound of her own heartbeat. "I have loved you," he said slowly, like a man being careful with something that mattered. "Since the morning you walked out of Garfield's store with flour and a candle, and looked at this town like you were calculating exactly what it owed you and what you were willing to earn." She laughed, startled by the specificity of it, by the realization that he had been watching her that day too, that he had been watching her before she had ever been aware of being watched. "That was the first day," she said. "I know," he said. He kissed her again, there in the road under all those stars, and she held on to him and felt the reality of him, the solid, warm, honest reality of this man, and thought that she had come to Texas with a carpet bag and a letter about 40 scrubland acres, and had found something she had not known enough to look for. October was a turning month. The ranch hands on the surrounding properties began the fall gather, and Milton was busy from before dawn to after dusk, riding with his crew, which had expanded to 3 men now including Pete, moving cattle and working the counts and attending to all the 1,000 details of a working ranch heading into the cooler season. Helen saw him less during those weeks and did not complain about it because she understood the rhythm of his work and respected it, and because she was herself not idle. She had made a decision in the first week of October, turning it over carefully for several days before she committed to it. She went to see the county land assessor in the larger town of Belleville, 20 miles east, and she asked about the process of properly establishing a homestead claim on her 40 acres, making it fully and legally hers in every way. And while she was there, she also inquired about the possibility of a small business registration for a seamstress and alterations service operating out of that property. The assessor, a fussy, precise man who appreciated precision in others, walked her through the paperwork with a thoroughness she found genuinely helpful. She rode back to Millhaven in the afternoon with the documentation folded in her carpet bag, and a feeling in her chest that was not triumph exactly, but was the particular satisfaction of a foundation being laid correctly. She told Milton about it one evening when the gather was done, and he came to sit on her step in the way they had established, bringing a small bundle of late wildflowers he had picked from the draw on his property, the ones that bloomed the latest and persisted the longest. He listened to her explain the homestead filing and the business registration, and when she was done he said, "You are remarkable." "I'm practical," she said. "You're both," he said. She took the wildflowers and put them in the blue pitcher she kept on the table for exactly this purpose, because she had started keeping a pitcher on the table after the first time he brought flowers in September, and she stood looking at them for a moment. "Milton," she said. "Yes," she turned around. "I told you what my perfect life looked like, in July by the arroyo." "I remember every word of it," he said. She looked at him. "Have you been building it?" she asked quietly, "piece by piece? The roof, the coop, the fence, coming on Fridays, the flowers." He held her gaze with that steadiness that she had come to understand was not reserve but was something deeper, something that came from a man who had decided a long time ago not to do things by half measures. "Yes," he said. She felt that in her whole body. "Why didn't you say so?" she asked. "I thought showing was better," he said. "Saying is easy. I wanted you to see it built." She crossed the room and kissed him before he could say anything else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. He proposed in November, under circumstances that were entirely characteristic of him. They were working together on the larger section of the garden that she wanted to expand for spring, which required moving a substantial pile of rocks that had accumulated along the eastern edge, a task that was considerably less romantic in execution than in concept. They were muddy and tired when he stopped working, set down his shovel, and turned to look at her. "Helen," he said. She looked up from the rock she was moving. "Marry me," he said. She looked at him. He was standing in the November light, dirty from the work, his hat pushed back, and he was looking at her with that absolute and undefended directness that she had come to know was the deepest thing about him. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes. Obviously," he said, and a smile was working at the corner of his mouth. "Milton," she said patiently, "you have been building my life one board at a time since May. Obviously, yes." The smile broke open then, full and warm, and he came across the half-moved rock pile and took her muddy hands in his muddy hands and kissed her with a thoroughness that suggested the rocks could wait. They were married in December in the leaning white church, with the Millhaven community in attendance, because a community that has watched something good develop wants to be present when it is made official. Mrs. Pratt wept the comfortable tears of a woman who has been right about something she always knew would happen. Pete wore a collar that was visibly strangling him and bore it with the stoic cheerfulness of his nature. Dora Finch stood with Helen as her witness, and Frank Finch stood with Milton, and the ceremony was performed by the minister in a manner that was warm and not too long, which was Helen's principal requirement, having sat through 2 interminable church weddings in St. Louis. Helen wore a dress she had made herself, cream-colored with pale blue trim at the collar and cuffs, simple and good, made of fabric she had ordered from a shop in San Antonio and waited 6 weeks for. It was the finest thing she had ever made. Milton wore his best suit, which was dark and well-cut and fit him properly because he had purchased it specifically for this occasion, driven 40 miles to do so, and come back saying nothing about it. She only learned this from Pete, who could not help himself. When the minister said the words and Milton put the ring on her finger, a small and plain gold band that he had made by the jeweler in Belleville, she felt something she struggled later to articulate. Not the giddiness she had observed in other women's accounts of their wedding days, but something more fundamental, something that had the quality of rightness, of arriving somewhere she had been moving toward since before she knew she was moving. "Mrs. Warren," Milton said quietly in the church after the minister had finished and the room was just barely beginning to stir. "Yes," she said. "Welcome home," he said. She understood what he meant. She was her own home. She had been her own home for years, had built it in herself long before she built it in the Texas dirt. But she also understood that home could be more than one thing, could be the self you carry and also the person you choose to stand beside. And standing beside Milton Warren in the leaning white church in Millhaven, Texas, in December of 1878 felt like both. The wedding supper was held in the church hall, which the community had decorated with winter greenery and what ribbons could be found. And there was more food than anyone could reasonably eat because the ranching families had contributed dishes, and the Pratt house had produced 3 pies and Dora Finch had made a honey cake that was genuinely extraordinary. There was fiddle music from a ranch hand named Clarence who had a gift for it, and dancing on the plank floor, and the particular warmth of a room full of people who are genuinely glad about something. Milton was not a dancer in any accomplished sense, but he held her on the floor with a confidence that made up for technical deficiency, and she laughed into his shoulder during the second song, and he said into her hair, "I know," which was the most accurate response possible. They went home that night to her property, their property. He had moved the bulk of his personal belongings in the week before, keeping the ranch running with Pete managing things for the week, and the small house felt different with his things in it, fuller, more definitively occupied. She stood in the doorway and looked at the room, the way his coat hung on the hook beside hers, the way his boots stood on the mat beside hers, the blue pitcher on the table with the last of November's dried grasses in it. "Tell me again," he said, coming to stand behind her. "What?" "Your perfect life," he said. "Tell me what's still missing." She turned and looked at him in the lamplight, this man she had married, this careful, honest, deliberate man who had taken every word she said seriously enough to act on it. "The porch," she said. "In spring," he said, "the apple tree. I already found one dormant from a nursery in Belleville. It will go in the south corner." She stared at him. "You found an apple tree. You said you believed in planting things you might not live to see in their full glory," he said. "I thought that was worth taking seriously." She put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him, and the lamp burned low behind them in the house that was becoming what it was always supposed to be. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was mild by Texas standards, which did not mean it was easy, but it meant that the cattle losses Milton had feared were minimal, and that the patching of the house continued to hold. Helen's sewing work slowed in January and February as it always did, but she used the slower time to do something she had been thinking about since before the wedding, which was to write up a proper account of her services and her prices on a card that she left with Garfield's store and the minister and Mrs. Pratt, so that anyone coming to Millhaven from the surrounding area would know where to find skilled seamstress work. It was a small thing, but it produced results within 2 weeks. A ranching family from 9 miles out sent their eldest daughter with 3 dresses to be let out and 2 to be taken in, and paid cash money on collection, which was Helen's preferred arrangement. Word traveled, as it does in country where the distances between people are large and the number of reliable tradespeople is small. By February, she had a waiting list. She told Milton about it at supper on a Tuesday, the kind of ordinary supper in the warm house with the wind moving outside that had become the rhythm of her life, and he listened and said, "You need more space to work." "The front room is fine," she said. "You're working on the kitchen table," he said. "I've always worked on the kitchen table." "You have a business now," he said. "You need a workroom." She looked at him. "Milton, I'm not telling you what you need," he said calmly. "I'm telling you what I'm going to build you, because you need it and because I can, and because watching you work on the kitchen table when you could have a proper space is something I intend to fix." She considered arguing. She had the reflex of it from years of doing everything herself. But she had also learned in these months of knowing him that there was a particular pride in him about building things for her that was not controlling or diminishing but was its own form of love, was the way he expressed what he felt, with his hands and his time and his planning. She had also learned to distinguish between help that diminished and help that honored, and Milton Warren had never offered her the former. "It would need good light," she said. "Windows on the south and east sides." "I know," he said. He built the workroom in March, extending the back of the house with the help of Frank Finch, who was not only good company but was a professional carpenter, and therefore considerably more skilled than Pete, who helped with materials and goodwill. The room went up over 2 weekends and took another week of finishing. And when it was done, it had 2 windows exactly as Helen had specified. A long table built to the right height for cutting fabric standing, and shelves on the north wall for her notions and thread, and the bolts of material she had begun to stock. She stood in it the morning after it was finished, in the early light coming through the east window, and she felt the particular quality of a dream made concrete, made wood and glass and nail, made real enough to stand in. She heard Milton in the kitchen behind her, the familiar sound of him making coffee in the morning, and she thought about the picture she had described to him in July by the arroyo, all those pieces of it, and she thought about how many of them had been built into the actual fabric of her days. She went back into the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind, which was not her typical morning gesture, and which caused him to go very still in the particular way he went still when she surprised him. "Thank you," she said into his back. He turned around and looked at her with the expression she had come to know was his love, not performed, not announced, but visible to her now as clearly as the morning light. "You built most of it yourself," he said. "Not the room," she said. "You described it," he said. "Describing it is the harder part. Anyone can follow a plan." She thought about that for the rest of the day. Spring came with all the extravagant force that spring applies in the Texas hill country, everything bursting green and the bluebonnets running wild along the fence lines, and the creek at the bottom of the arroyo running clear and quick with snowmelt from somewhere north. Helen put in her expanded garden, twice the size as planned, and planted the seeds she had been saving and ordering since January. The apple tree from Belleville went into the south corner of the house exactly where she had said she wanted it, a slender, dormant thing wrapped in burlap that unfolded into cautious life over the following weeks. The porch was built in April. Milton and Frank did most of it, and it ran across the full front of the house, with a railing that Milton made particular because he had been thinking about it all winter, each post cut clean and set solid. He put 2 chairs on it, simple slatted wooden chairs, and he put a small table between them for coffee cups. He came to find her when it was done in the workroom where she was finishing a wedding dress for the Hendricks' eldest daughter. He stood in the doorway. "Come see," he said. She followed him around the house and stopped when she saw it. The porch extended across the whole front, opening the house to the morning light, the 2 chairs facing east, the land rolling away from them in the green of early spring, the mesquite trees at the western edge throwing their particular lacy shade. She sat down in one of the chairs. He brought 2 cups of coffee from inside and sat in the other. They sat in the morning, watching the land wake up, and Helen held her cup in both hands and felt the precise and specific quality of a thing described becoming a thing lived. "This is it," she said. "Is it right?" he said. "Exactly right," she said. He said nothing. He drank his coffee and watched the light move across the land, and she watched him from the corner of her eye, this man who had taken her words seriously enough to build a life from them, and she felt a love for him so large it was almost frightening. In June, she knew she was pregnant. She was not entirely surprised. She was, however, aware of the weight of it, the way a new thing places itself at the center of everything and quietly reorganizes what you thought you knew. She told Milton on a Sunday evening, sitting on the porch they had built, in the early summer dark with fireflies starting in the garden. She said, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her. There was something in her voice that made him set down his coffee. "We're going to have a child," she said. He was very still for a moment. Then he set down the cup and reached over and took her hand in both of his, and he held it with the careful intensity of a man holding something he recognizes as extraordinary. "When," he said. "January, I think," she said, "or late December." He said nothing for a long time. Then, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I'm very well, actually. Are you?" He looked at her, and what she saw on his face was something she had not seen before in quite that form, a kind of unguarded wonder, as though something he had wanted for a long time but had not allowed himself to name had suddenly been placed in front of him. "Yes," he said quietly. "I am very much all right." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat in the dark with the fireflies moving in the garden and the land going quiet around them. And she thought that this was what she had described by the arroyo, not in these specific terms but in the spirit of them. Someone beside her who was interested in who she was and willing to be known in return. And she could not have known in July that this was where the following words would lead, but here it was, built from what she had said, exact and real and overwhelming. The pregnancy went well enough, though the summer heat was not kind to a woman in her condition, and Helen managed it with characteristic efficiency by working her mornings and resting her afternoons and refusing to be managed by anyone, including the well-meaning women of Millhaven who had opinions about what a pregnant woman should and should not do. Dora Finch was her particular ally in this period. Dora, whose own pregnancy with her second child coincided with the middle months of Helen's, came to the porch on Tuesday mornings and they drank weak tea and talked with the frank honesty that had characterized their friendship from the beginning. Dora had no patience for sentimentality, but a great deal of patience for the practical realities of being a woman building a life in a place that was still sorting out what kind of place it wanted to be. "They're going to try to make you stop working," Dora said one August morning, meaning the collective they of Millhaven female opinion. "They can try," Helen said. Milton asks if I'm tired," Helen said. "If I say no, he believes me." Dora nodded with the specific approval of a woman who has thought about what a good man looks like. "Rare thing," she said. "I know," Helen said. He was attentive in the way of someone who had decided that attention was a form of love, who checked the woodpile without being asked, and made sure there was always enough water hauled and, in September, quietly arranged with Pete to handle the morning feeding of Helen's chickens, which had indeed multiplied, now numbering 11, so that she did not have to do it in the dark before dawn. She did not find out about the chicken arrangement until Pete mentioned it. She went to Milton about it, not with anger but with the question clear on her face. "I told Pete to tell you," Milton said. He was mending a bridle at the kitchen table, a domestic task that he performed with the same steadiness he applied to everything. "He told me 2 weeks after the fact," she said. "I know, he takes his time." She sat down across from him. "Milton, I am pregnant, not incapable." "I know," he said, without looking up from the bridle. "Then why?" He set the bridle down and looked at her. "Because it's dark before dawn and the ground is uneven near the coop. And you are not incapable, but you are also carrying our child, and I am not willing to have you fall in the dark over a feed bucket," he said. "I did not tell you because you would have argued and then gone and done it anyway, and that would have been fine, except it would have worried me, and I would rather spend my concern on things that are actually dangerous." She looked at him for a long moment. "You're very logical for someone who is also being completely unreasonable," she said. "I know," he said. He picked up the bridle. "In the spring I'll move the coop closer," she sighed. "Thank you," she said, because it was the truest response. October and November moved in the particular rhythm of an occupied and purposeful life. The workroom was busy. A family from outside town had a daughter being married in November, and the wedding dress commission was the most complex work Helen had undertaken, with detailed beadwork on the bodice that required exceptional light and the kind of concentration that needed the house to be quiet. Milton developed the habit, without discussion, of directing Pete and any other necessary noise to the far side of the ranch buildings on the afternoons when Helen was working on the beading. She found this out later, as she found out most of Milton's quiet orchestrations after the fact and from someone else. "You arrange things," she said to him one evening. "I do," he agreed, "without announcing it." "Announcing it would require explaining it, which would require you to argue about whether it was necessary," he said. "And is it necessary?" "It seems to be," he said. She threw a biscuit at him, which he caught, and the matter was closed. The child was born on December 28, 1879, just 3 days past Christmas, in the house that had been patched and mended and extended into something real. The doctor from Millhaven attended, a capable young man named Whitfield who had trained in Austin and had the good sense not to offer unnecessary opinions. Dora Finch was there as Helen had asked, steady and practical and present in exactly the way that was needed. Milton was in the front room, which was as close as convention and the doctor allowed him, and Helen was aware of him there as a kind of constant warmth at the edge of everything she was occupied with. The child was a boy. He was brought out by Dr. Whitfield and placed in Milton's arms, and Helen heard, through the bedroom wall, Milton's voice say something very quietly that she could not make out, and whatever it was, it had a quality to it that she would remember for the rest of her life. When she was settled and the room was cleaned and Dr. Whitfield had gone, Milton came to sit on the edge of the bed with the child in his arms, and he looked down at this new person with the same quality of unguarded wonder she had seen on his face the night she told him, magnified now into something almost overwhelming. "He needs a name," she said. "Yes. I was thinking," she said, "James, after nothing in particular, just because it's a good solid name." "James Warren," Milton said, as though he was testing the weight of it. "James," he looked at her. "Yes. Hello, James," she said, taking the baby, and James Warren, who was 3 hours old and had a remarkably decisive expression for someone so new, seemed to consider this reasonable. The years that followed were the years of building, not the building of the house, which was now done, or the building of the life which had its shape, but the quieter and deeper building of a thing together. James Warren grew from a decisive-looking infant into a decisive-looking small boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's directness and a great deal of his own particular character that seemed to come from somewhere else entirely, possibly from the land itself, because he loved it with an early and uncomplicated intensity that surprised them both. He was 3 years old when he first rode with his father, up in the saddle in front of Milton, one of Milton's arms around him, and the expression on James's face as the horse moved was so purely joyful that Helen, watching from the porch, felt her eyes fill in the particular way of moments that are almost too good to bear. She was watching from the porch she had asked for, holding her coffee in both hands, sitting in the chair that was hers, and the apple tree in the south corner had been growing for 3 springs now and had produced, this past summer, its first 4 apples, small and imperfect and the sweetest thing she had ever eaten. The milk cow arrived in 1881, a good-natured roan named Clara who produced more butter than even Helen's appetite for it required, which meant she began selling butter to Garfield's store on a weekly basis, which Garfield was happy about because it was considerably better than what he had been getting from the previous supplier. The butter. She had mentioned butter. Fresh butter from a milk cow, that specific comfort of her earliest childhood. She had said it almost as an afterthought, by the arroyo, one of those small specific things that is too small to seem like a real desire until you are standing at a churn with cream that you produced, and you understand that it is not small at all, that the small things are sometimes what the larger life is made of. The town of Millhaven had grown. It was 1882 now, and the railroad that had been rumored for years had finally been confirmed, would be coming through 8 miles south of town, and the effect of this confirmation on the region was immediate and considerable. New families arrived. 2 new storefronts opened on the main street. A proper hotel was being discussed. Dr. Whitfield expanded his practice. Frank Finch had more carpentry work than he could reasonably take on, and had hired 2 men to help him. Helen's seamstress business had grown to the point where she had, in the spring of 1882, hired a young woman named Ruth to assist her. Ruth was 20 years old, the daughter of a farming family from the county's northern edge, and she was nimble with a needle and quick to learn, and within 3 months was handling the simpler alterations independently while Helen took on the larger commissions. It meant that Helen's income was now reliable enough that they had been able, at the beginning of the year, to have a real conversation about the future of the ranch, about whether to expand the herd, about the mathematics of what the railroad would mean for cattle prices. "The land south of the arroyo," Milton said, one morning on the porch, James playing in the yard below them, chasing the one rooster who would allow himself to be chased. Jensen wants to sell. He's moving to his daughter's place in New Mexico. If we could get it, we'd have river access year-round. How much land? Helen said. 60 acres. And the price, he told her. She thought about it. That's the savings and then some, she said. Yes. If the cattle prices rise with the railroad the way everyone expects, it pays itself in 3 years, she said. That's my calculation too, he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the land, at James and the rooster at the apple tree, which had 32 apples on it this year, which she had counted. Buy the land, she said. He looked at her. It's the right thing, she said. We build from solid ground, that's what we do. He reached across the small table between the chairs, the one that was always for coffee cups, and took her hand. He did not say anything. He held her hand and looked out at the land, and she understood that this was also his language, this quiet and consistent presence. They bought the Jensen 60 acres in May. Jensen, who was 71 and moving with some reluctance and a great deal of practical acceptance, walked the property line with Milton on the day of transfer and told him everything he knew about the seasonal water patterns and the good grass sections, and where the rattlesnakes were thickest in August. Helen served coffee on the porch, and Jensen told her, with the directness of old age, that she had done well with the place. It was broken down when you came, he said. He had known the property for years. It had good bones, she said. Most things do, he said. Take someone with the right eyes to see them. She thought about that often. In the summer of 1882, Helen found herself pregnant again. She was 28 years old, and James was 2.5, and the workroom was busy, and the garden was bigger than ever, and she looked at this new reality with the same careful assessment she applied to everything. We'll need to think about space, she said to Milton. I've been thinking about it, he said. I thought another room on the north side. James could have his own room, and the new child could have the back room while it's small. She looked at him. You've been thinking about it. Since March, he said. I only found out 2 weeks ago, she said. He said nothing, just looked at her with that look she knew so well by now, the look that said he had been paying attention in the way he always paid attention, quietly and in advance. You knew before I did, she said. I suspected, he said carefully. She laughed, which dissolved into something softer, and she went to him, and he held her in the kitchen on a summer afternoon, with the light coming through the window, and the sound of James outside, and the chickens, and the ordinary and extraordinary fact of her life. The second child was a girl, born in February of 1883, with the same decisive expression as her brother, and what was clearly going to be her mother's dark hair. They named her Clara, not after the cow but after Helen's mother, who had died when Helen was 14, and whose memory she kept as something worth honoring. Clara Warren entered the world with the confidence of someone who already knew exactly what she wanted from it, and the household reconfigured itself around her arrival the way households do, with the grace and difficulty that is particular to new life. James, who was 3 now, regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way within 2 weeks to a proprietary tenderness that made both his parents quietly overwhelmed on separate occasions. He brought things to show her. A rock, a particularly interesting stick, the rooster feather he had been treasuring. Clara, for her part, regarded him with the unfocused attention of the very young that he clearly found deeply satisfying. Milton added the north room to the house in the spring of 1883, and it was a good room, solid and well lit, and James moved into it with great ceremony and a conviction that it was the finest room in the world, which Helen did not dispute. The apple tree bloomed that spring with an extravagance that suggested it had finally found its full confidence. The blossoms were white and faintly pink, and they lasted 3 weeks, and the bees worked them with an industry that suggested a productive fall. Helen stood under the apple tree one morning in the blossom season, Clara on her hip, James somewhere behind her investigating the underside of a log with the scientific commitment of a 3-year-old. And she stood in the shade of the tree she had said she wanted, The tree she had believed in before it existed. The tree she had planted knowing she might not live to see it in its full glory. It was in its full glory. It was white and sweet-smelling and alive with bees, and it was hers, planted in the south corner exactly where she had said, on land she owned absolutely, beside a house she had helped build from its broken beginning. She heard Milton behind her, his step familiar to her after years of knowing it, and he came to stand beside her and looked up at the tree. "Beautiful," he said. "I know," she said. "I am looking at it." "So am I," he said, and he was not looking at the tree. She looked at him then. This man who had asked her to describe her perfect life and had spent every day since making it real. This man who had taken her seriously from the first morning in the street, who had built her a workroom with the right windows, and arranged for her chickens to be fed in the dark, so she wouldn't fall, who had found a dormant apple tree in a nursery 40 miles away, because she had said she believed in planting things you might not live to see in their full glory. She thought about the 24-year-old woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in this town with a carpet bag and a letter in the wind nearly taking her hat, a woman who had been quietly certain that she could build something from those 40 acres and quietly uncertain about almost everything else. She thought about what she would tell that woman if she could. She would say, "Keep describing it. Keep saying what you want, the real things, the specific ones, the small ones about butter and morning coffee and porches and apple trees. Say them out loud to people who are listening. The right person will be listening, and the right person will take you seriously enough to build every word." "What are you thinking?" Milton said. "About the stagecoach," she said. "About the first day." "The wind nearly took your hat," he said. She turned to look at him. "You remember that. I was in the street when the stage came in," he said. "I saw you grab for it. I saw the look on your face when you straightened up and looked at the town." "What kind of look?" "Like you were deciding whether it was worth your time," he said. "And then you decided yes." She shook her head slowly. "You've been watching me from the very beginning." "Yes," he said simply. "Why?" she said, though she knew. "'Cause," he said, "you had your hat back and you picked up your bag and you walked into that town like you owned it. And I thought I had never seen anything as certain as that in my life." She looked at him with everything she had accumulated over these years of knowing him. All the mornings on the porch and the evenings inside and the work done together and the children made and the land extended and the love grown from its first cautious roots into something large enough to live inside. "Milton Warren," she said. "Helen Warren," he said, and she loved the way he said her name, the way he had always said her name, as though it were something worth saying carefully. Clara made a sound on her hip, the emphatic sound of a baby who has been patient long enough, and James appeared from behind them, having successfully excavated whatever was living under the log and wanting his parents to assess it, and the morning reconfigured itself into the particular useful chaos of family. But later, when the children were settled and the evening was quiet, they sat on the porch in the last of the light, the 2 chairs and the small table between them with the coffee cups on it, and Helen looked at the land going gold in the sunset, at the mesquite trees casting their long shadows, at the apple tree in the south corner standing in its full white bloom, and she thought that she had described this and it had been built and she was living inside it. Every word of it. The milk cow was in the near pasture, Clara her namesake, moving in the late light with the uncomplicated contentment of a well-kept animal. The chickens were settling, a sound familiar to Helen as her own heartbeat. The workroom was closed for the evening, the dresses in progress hanging on their forms in the good south and east light, Ruth's careful work beside her own. The garden ran along the east side of the house, full and growing, the tomatoes coming on, the beans climbing their poles, the squash spreading. The house was real. The porch was real. The apple tree was real. The man beside her was real, drinking his coffee in the evening quiet, looking at his land, their land, with the settled peace of someone who is exactly where they chose to be. He reached over and took her hand, which was something he had done 10,000 times by now, and she held his hand and felt the weight and warmth of it and thought about the question he had asked her on a July afternoon by the arroyo in the first summer of knowing him. Tell me what your perfect life looks like. Not what you have now. Not what you are working toward. Just if you could close your eyes and open them and it was exactly right. She closed her eyes. She opened them. The land was gold in the evening light. The apple tree was in bloom. Her children were inside, warm and fed and known. The man she loved was beside her, his hand in hers, as present and solid and honest as the day she had met him. She looked at Milton Warren and she said, "This is it. This is exactly it." He looked at her with the expression she had learned to read like a language, the expression that was his love, steady and unperformed and entirely certain. "I know," he said. The wind moved across the Texas evening, gentle and warm, carrying the smell of the apple blossoms and the grass and the long-gone distance. And Helen Warren sat on her porch with her coffee and her husband and the life she had described and he had built. And she was, in every way that counted, completely and entirely and perfectly home. The seasons continued to turn, as seasons do, with their particular rhythms of work and rest and renewal. James learned to ride on his own that fall of 1883, not with the careful steadiness of his father, but with a boldness that made his mother pray quietly, and his father keep a closer eye than he let on. Clara progressed from the emphatic sounds of infancy to a vocabulary at 9 months that already seemed designed to make her preferences unmistakably clear, a quality that made her father smile and her mother recognize with something between pride and inevitability. The railroad came through 8 miles south in 1884, and the effect on Millhaven was exactly what everyone had predicted, and also nothing like anyone had quite expected. New families continued to arrive. The town added a doctor's office separate from Dr. Whitfield's house, a proper feed supply establishment, and a dress shop that Helen observed with interest rather than concern, because the dress shop sold ready-made garments from Eastern factories, which was a different thing entirely from what Helen did, and not a competition she worried about. Milton's herd expanded with the railroad access. The cattle prices improved in the way that everyone had calculated, and by 1885, the Jensen's 60 acres that they had bought on calculation, and faith had paid itself back twice over. Milton was not a man who spoke much about financial success, but he had a particular quality of settled satisfaction in those years that Helen recognized as the result of a man whose work was producing what he had worked for. They had a conversation in the summer of 1885 that was, in its way, one of the most important they had ever had. It was on the porch, a Sunday morning, James 5 years old and reading with a concentration that bordered on aggressive, Clara 2.5 and asleep inside still, and the apple tree full of small green apples ripening toward their September glory. Helen said, "I want to take Ruth on as a partner." Milton looked at her. "In the business," she said. "She has been doing work that is worth more than a wage for 3 years. If I offer her partnership, she stays. If I don't, she will eventually go somewhere that values her better." "What kind of partnership?" he said. "A formal arrangement. She puts in her labor, I put in the space and the business I've built, and we share the income from the commissions we bring in equally after expenses." He thought about it with the same consideration he gave everything. "Is she interested?" "I haven't asked yet," Helen said. "I wanted to think it through with you first." He looked at her. There was something in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of warm recognition. "You've already thought it through," he said. "You're telling me." "I'm asking what you think," she said. "It's our business too. The workroom is our property." "Helen," he said, "you built that business from a card left at Garfield's store. Ruth is a good worker and she's loyal to you. If your assessment is that she's worth partnering, I trust your assessment. The workroom is yours. I built it for you." She looked at him. "It's ours." "It is," he said, "and so are the decisions about what happens in it." She asked Ruth the following Tuesday. Ruth sat at the long table in the workroom with a bolt of blue calico unrolled in front of her, and she was quiet for a full 30 seconds after Helen finished explaining, which was not Ruth's typical response to anything. Then she said, "You're serious?" I don't say things I don't mean, Helen said. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was partly overwhelming and partly the very practical look of a 23-year-old woman who was doing a rapid calculation about her own future. Yes, she said. Yes, absolutely yes. Helen put out her hand, and Ruth shook it, and that was the founding of what Millhaven would eventually know as the Warren and Finch sewing and alterations, though it would be another 2 years before Ruth married a young man named Davis Finch, no relation to Frank, and the name would change. The apple harvest of 1885 was extraordinary. Helen counted 47 apples and put them in a bushel basket and made 2 pies and a sauce, and kept the rest in the cool of the root cellar that Milton had added to the property in the spring. She put a jar of apple sauce on Dora Finch's front step with a note that said only, "From the tree we planted," and Dora came by the next morning to say that it was the best thing she had eaten all season, and they sat on the porch with coffee and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. Their friendship had become one of the anchoring things of Helen's life. Dora, who now had 3 children of her own and a forthright opinion about everything from local politics to the best method of preserving vegetables, was the person Helen talked to about the things that were not quite ready to be talked about with Milton, not because she kept secrets from him, but because some thoughts need the particular permission of female friendship to become clear. It was to Dora that Helen first said, in the autumn of 1885, that she thought she might want to teach sewing. Dora said, "Generally," Helen said, "the school has Mrs. Hartley, who is perfectly good with the primary students, but there's no one who does needlework and domestic arts properly. I talked to the minister last week and he said the board has been discussing it. You'd be teaching the older girls," Dora said, "and some of the boys for basic mending," Helen said. "I sewed my own father's shirt buttons from the time I was 8. Boys can sew." "Good luck explaining that to Millhaven," Dora said, but she was smiling. She brought it to Milton that evening in the way she had learned to bring things directly and after she had thought it through. He listened, looking at his coffee cup, and when she finished he said, "The business would still run. Ruth can handle the daily work. I'd only be at the school 2 afternoons a week. Is this what you want?" he said. "I think so," she said. "I think there's something in it about being known. What I said by the arroyo about being known for my work and my presence in a way that mattered to someone other than myself. I teach Ruth, but she is one person. There's something about teaching that is larger than that." He looked at her with the steadiness that was still, after all these years, one of the things she loved most about him. "Then you should do it," he said. "You don't have concerns," she said. "I have confidence," he said. "Which is different." She taught needlework and domestic arts at the Millhaven School for the first time in the spring of 1886, 2 Wednesday afternoons a month, with 12 students ranging from 9 to 14, and the experience was exactly as good and as complicated as she had expected. Some children were resistant, particularly the boys, and she handled this the way she handled most resistance, which was to make the work interesting enough that resistance became more effort than participation. She showed them how a sail worked on the principle of a seam. She showed them how the same stitch that mended a shirt was used in surgery, a point that produced rapt attention she had not anticipated. She talked about the economics of cloth, how much it cost, how long it took to make, why repairing was sometimes a more significant skill than building new. By the end of the first term, 10 of the 12 students were doing competent work, and 2 of them, including a 9-year-old boy named Thomas Riley, who had arrived convinced this was the worst afternoon of his week, were showing something approaching genuine interest. Mrs. Hartley told Helen at the end of term that she had never seen that boy apply himself to anything. Helen thought about that on the walk home and felt something she could not quite articulate, but that had to do with reach, with the way a thing you do can travel further than you intended. She told Milton about Thomas Riley at supper. He listened, watching her face as she talked, with the attention he always paid her. "You knew this would happen," he said when she was done. "I hoped," she said. "You knew," he said. He was smiling. "You described it." You said you wanted to be known for your work in a way that mattered to someone other than yourself. This is the someone." She looked at him across the table in the kitchen of the house they had built from what was broken, in the life they had built from what she had described. "You remember everything I say," she said. "Every word," he said. "I always have." James came in from outside at that moment, announcing with great urgency that the rooster had gotten over the garden fence again, and Clara appeared behind him with equal urgency about something that turned out to be a caterpillar she had found on the porch step, and the kitchen filled with the particular productive noise of family, and Milton looked at Helen over the heads of their children with the look she knew was just for her, the look that said this, exactly this. She returned it. She thought briefly of the woman on the stagecoach and the 40 broken acres and the wind, and she thought of everything that had come from describing what she wanted out loud to a man by an arroyo on a July afternoon, a man who had taken her seriously enough to build every word. By 1887, Millhaven had grown enough to need 2 teachers in the school, and Helen's 2-afternoon-a-month position became a formal part-time post with a small salary, which she donated half of to the school's book fund because the children needed more books and the school board was slow about it. The Warren ranch had expanded twice more. They had 60 head more than when they started together, and Milton had hired 2 additional hands, young men both, who lived in the bunkhouse that had been expanded in 1886, and who were managed by Pete, now 28 and more settled in himself, with the easy authority of someone who has been trusted long enough to become trustworthy. Pete married a woman named Rosa in the spring of 1887, a dark-eyed, cheerful woman from a family that had ranched in Texas for 2 generations before the land question made things complicated. Helen liked her immediately. Rosa could talk with anyone and worked as hard as any 3 people Helen had ever known, and she had Pete looked at with the particular warmth of a woman who understood her husband's good qualities and intended to make use of them. The wedding was held on the Warren property because Pete had been part of this story from its beginning, and it was right for it to happen here, and Helen organized it with the thoroughness she brought to anything she organized, and it was a good day. Genuinely, the kind of day that even years later people would say was a fine one. She danced with Milton at Pete's wedding, properly this time, because in the years since their own wedding she had taught him the steps and he had applied himself to learning them with characteristic serious attention, and he was now, if not graceful, at least reliably correct, and she fit against him so naturally that it did not matter. "We have come a long way," she said, into his shoulder, which she could do easily because he was taller by a good margin. "From where?" he said. "From wherever the beginning was," she said. He thought about it. "Garfield's store," he said. "You had flour and a candle. And you were carrying lumber," she said. "I always have something to carry," he said. He was not talking about lumber. She held on to him in the dance and felt the full 7 years of knowing him, all its weight and warmth, all the mornings and evenings and difficult patches and the building and the apple tree and the children and the land, and she thought that she had been given something extraordinary, not just in him but in the asking, in being asked to say what she wanted, in being taken seriously enough that saying it was the same as building it. "Milton," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said. "For asking." He held her a little closer. "Thank you for answering," he said. The fiddle played. The summer evening was warm and close and full of stars. Pete and Rosa danced nearby, Pete with no more skill than Milton but with enormous enthusiasm, and Rosa was laughing. The children were somewhere at the edge of the light, James looking after Clara with the proprietary tenderness he had always shown her. The land stretched away from the light of the lanterns into the Texas dark, wide and quiet, and theirs. Helen Warren stood in the middle of her life and felt it, all of it, its fullness and its weight and its rightness, and she understood that the perfect life was not the one she had imagined by the arroyo exactly as described, not a drawing but a living thing, grown from those words but into something larger than words. It was this. It was all of this. The porch in the morning, the apple tree, the workroom with its good south light, the children running in the yard. The man beside her who had listened when she spoke, who had believed her capable of knowing what she wanted, who had built and kept building because she had described it and he had taken every word seriously. It was this. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And in the morning she would wake in the house they had made real, and make coffee, and sit on the porch in the early light, and watch the land wake up, and he would come and sit beside her with his own cup, and they would hold the quiet between them like something they were both keeping safe, and the apple tree would stand in its corner full of apples or full of blossoms or bare in the winter waiting for spring, and it would be enough. It would always be enough. It had been built, word by word, out of what she said and what he heard and what they made together from the space between those two things, and it would stand as long as they stood. And after them it would stand in James and Clara and in every life that had been touched by the ordinary and extraordinary fact of two people who chose each other honestly and built what they chose. The fiddle played on into the Texas summer night, and Helen Warren danced with her husband under the stars, and the life she had described was alive around her in every direction, and she was known in it, and loved in it, and home in it, completely and at last and forever.